At some point in the last week, your body sent you a warning. Maybe it was a headache building behind your eyes. Maybe it was the sharp crack of a shin against a table corner. Maybe it was something deeper, the slow ache of a muscle pushed too far, the electric jolt of a burn from a hot pan. Whatever it was, the signal arrived, and almost immediately you wanted it gone. That instinct is completely natural. Pain is one of the most universally disliked experiences in human existence. Across every culture, every language, every era of recorded history, humans have been trying to eliminate it. We built entire pharmacological industries around it. We developed surgeries, therapies, and chemical compounds all pointed at one goal: make the pain stop. And somewhere in the back of the mind, most people have had the thought, what if it just never came at all? There are people alive right now for whom that thought is not a fantasy. It is the only reality they have ever known. Not people who are numb, not people who have learned to tolerate pain, people whose bodies were built, from the very first cell division, without the capacity to produce a single pain signal. Not once, not ever, not in infancy, not in childhood, not now. Their condition has a name. It is called congenital insensitivity to pain with anhidrosis, a rare genetic condition that has been documented in medical literature since 1951. It affects roughly 1 in every 25,000 people. And the more closely scientists have studied it, the more deeply uncomfortable the picture becomes. Because it does not look like freedom. It looks like something else entirely. Before going any further, it is worth establishing exactly what we are talking about, because the first instinct most people have when they hear congenital insensitivity to pain is to imagine someone who simply doesn't flinch, someone stoic, someone tough. That is not what this is. This condition comes down to a single genetic mistake. Every human body carries instructions for building a specific kind of nerve cell, the kind that detects damage and sends pain signals to the brain. For those nerve cells to grow properly, they need a chemical trigger, a growth signal that tells them to develop, connect, and wire themselves into the rest of the nervous system. In people with this condition, the part of their DNA responsible for receiving that growth signal is broken. The trigger fires, but nothing receives it, and as a result, the nerve cells that were supposed to become pain pathways simply never grow. Think about what that actually means. This is not a switch that gets flipped off. There is no switch. The wiring was never laid. The infrastructure does not exist. From the very first days of fetal development, the body grows up without building the system that was supposed to report on its own condition. Pain is not missing the way a word is missing from a sentence. It is missing the way a road is missing from a map where the road was never built. And here is where the first thing most people assume turns out to be wrong. Most people imagine the body's pain system as a passive receiver, something that sits there and picks up bad signals when they happen to arrive. Like a smoke detector waiting for smoke. The reality is nearly the opposite. The brain is not passive. It is actively predictive. It is constantly running a real-time model of the body's structural integrity, constantly receiving a stream of updates from joints, muscles, organs, and skin. Pain is the body's fastest internal communication system, not a passive alarm, an active, continuous broadcast, one that, in these patients, has been broadcasting static since before they were born. We will come back to what happens when that broadcast goes silent. First, there is something else about this condition that most people do not expect. It is not only about pain. The same genetic mistake that prevents pain pathways from forming also disrupts the part of the nervous system that runs in the background, invisible and automatic, managing heart rate, blood pressure, digestion, and, critically, the regulation of body temperature. People with this condition cannot sweat. Not reduced sweating, not impaired sweating, complete absence of sweating. And in the context of everything else this condition involves, that detail is sometimes treated as secondary. It is not secondary. Sweating is the human body's primary cooling mechanism. In conditions of physical exertion or external heat, a healthy body can produce up to 2 liters of sweat per hour, drawing heat away from core organs and preventing dangerous temperature rises. In these patients, that mechanism is absent. What this means in practice is that a child playing outside on a warm afternoon is not just running the risk of getting scraped and not feeling it. That child's core body temperature is actively rising with no ability to self-correct. Dangerous overheating is one of the leading acute threats for these patients, and it is disproportionately dangerous in young children, whose bodies have a smaller margin for error. This is the point at which the condition stops sounding like a superpower and starts sounding like what it actually is. A nervous system that never finished forming, not one missing sense, an entire communication architecture that is incomplete from birth. The Soroka University Medical Center in Israel has produced some of the most detailed clinical documentation on this condition available anywhere in the world. Over a 10-year period, researchers there followed a group of 63 patients, tracking their medical histories, their complications, and the progression of their conditions over time. The data is worth sitting with. During childhood, these patients averaged more than 2 significant bone fractures per year, not because they were unusually fragile, because they were unusually silent. A fracture in a patient without pain does not announce itself. There is no moment of collapse, no sharp signal forcing rest and recovery. The break happens, and the patient continues walking, continues running, continues putting mechanical load through a structure that has already failed. And that is where the damage compounds. Think about what that actually means. Every fracture that goes undetected is a fracture that heals improperly, or does not heal at all, because the behavior that would normally follow injury, rest, immobilization, the instinctive protection of a damaged area, never happens. The body does not stop. The body has no reason to stop. The signal that should have said stop was never sent. Over years, this pattern extends beyond fractures. Repeated undetected trauma to joints leads to a type of severe joint destruction driven not by a single catastrophic event, but by the slow accumulation of tiny injuries, each one unannounced, each one leaving behind a small deposit of structural damage that builds, quietly, over time. By adulthood, many patients develop severely damaged joints, particularly in the ankles, knees, and feet. The joint surfaces degrade, the surrounding bone remodels abnormally. The architecture of the joint breaks down in a way that can require mobility aids or surgical reconstruction, and the patient, throughout this entire process, never received a single warning. Not one, not a twinge, not an ache, not the low-level discomfort that would have told anyone else that something was going wrong. A lifetime of damage accumulated in total silence. This is also the pattern with infections. A cut that becomes infected in a person without this condition is painful. The inflammation hurts. The swelling hurts. That signal drives the person to clean the wound, seek treatment, protect the area. In these patients, the infection progresses without any of that feedback. What might have been a minor wound becomes a serious complication, not because the immune system failed, but because the behavioral response that the immune response depends on was never triggered. If you have ever thought of pain as a nuisance, as the thing your body does to punish you for being clumsy, consider this. Tell us, right now, in the comments, did you ever think of it as a protective system? Because that framing changes everything that comes next. There is a version of this story that ends here. The version where we say, this is a dangerous condition, life without pain is not the gift it seems, and the body needs its warning systems. That conclusion is true, but it is not the complete picture, because the data from those 63 patients and from the broader body of research points towards something stranger and more fundamental than a list of medical complications. It points toward the question of what a body actually is when it can no longer speak to itself. Pain, as most people understand it, is a nuisance, a penalty, the body's way of saying, don't do that again. But at the level of the brain, pain is not a punishment system, it is a monitoring system. Continuous, high bandwidth, running at every moment of every day, even when nothing is wrong. The reason it feels like noise is because most of the time, it is background noise. Low-level updates, micro-adjustments, the constant low hum of the body reporting its own structural status to the brain. In these patients, that entire reporting channel is gone, and this is the part that changes the picture entirely. Because it is not just pain that is absent. The same genetic mistake disrupts the full architecture of the automatic nervous system. Heart rate variability, blood pressure response to stress, the gut's capacity to signal distress. The cascade of physical changes that normally accompanies fear, danger, and exertion, changes that evolved not just to be felt but to be acted upon. These patients experience the world fully conscious, fully present, fully awake. But the feedback loop between the body and the brain that most people experience as the physical texture of being alive is fundamentally altered. Not absent in the way blindness removes vision. Altered in a way that is harder to map, because it is built into the architecture of every interaction between mind and body. If this is the first time you have watched a video on this channel, subscribe now, because we are just getting to the part that most science videos never reach. Let's stay here for a moment. For the vast majority of human history, pain was not understood as a system, it was understood as a sensation, something that happened to you from the outside. The philosophical history of pain is long and strange. Descartes drew diagrams of pain as a mechanical signal traveling up a cord from the site of injury to the brain, like pulling a rope attached to a bell. The pain was the bell, the injury was the pull. The system was simple, linear, passive. That model turned out to be wrong. Modern neuroscience understands pain as predictive and bidirectional. The brain does not wait for damage to send a report. It generates a continuous model of the body, including a prediction of where damage is likely to occur, and it adjusts pain signals based on context, expectation, and prior experience. This is why the same injury can feel different, depending on whether it happens in a safe environment or a threatening one. The brain is not simply receiving a signal, it is interpreting it, modulating it, and using it to update a constantly running internal map. This condition does not just remove the sensation of pain, it removes the body's capacity to generate and update that map through its most fundamental channel. Now scale that up. One person without that map is a medical case study. But the existence of that map, the fact that every brain in every human body is running it right now, is the reason civilization looks the way it does. The entire architecture of how humans work, rest, seek treatment, avoid repeated injury, and stay functional long enough to build anything, runs on that feedback. Remove the signal from enough people, and you are not just describing a medical condition. You are describing a population that cannot feel itself failing, a civilization-scale version of the same silence. Damage accumulating without report, errors compounding without correction, everything drifting, quietly, until something gives. That raises a question that pain researchers have been quietly sitting with, one that does not have a clean answer. If the brain's model of the body depends on continuous sensory feedback, and if the most important channel for that feedback is absent from birth, what does the brain's model of that body actually look like? Not emotionally, structurally, neurologically, is the map drawn differently? Is it drawn at all, in the same way? And if it is not, what are the downstream consequences for everything that map normally drives? Balance, coordination, the sense of physical self in space. Research into this is ongoing. The answers are not complete. That thread stays open. There is something else embedded in this picture that is easy to miss, because it requires pulling back from the clinical to the evolutionary. Pain is old. Not old the way language is old, or culture, or even consciousness. Pain is old in a different category entirely. The basic biological process that produces pain signals is conserved across hundreds of millions of years of evolution, not just in mammals, in fish, in amphibians, in organisms whose nervous systems look almost nothing like ours. Researchers have identified pain-responding nerve structures in animals whose lineages split from ours more than 500 million years ago. That is older than bones, older than lungs, older than the first creature that ever walked on land. That kind of conservation in biology is a signal. Evolution is not sentimental. Structures that persist across hundreds of millions of years of change, across the extinction of entire branches of the tree of life, are structures that are doing something critical, something that organisms without them kept dying for lack of. And here is the turn that makes this more than a history lesson. The organisms that lost functional pain systems did not adapt around the loss. The fossil record and genetic evidence both point the same direction. They disappeared. Pain did not survive because evolution was conservative. It survived because every lineage that shed it paid for it. This condition is not a malfunction in that context. It is a window into what happens when the biological record of that evolutionary pressure is interrupted, not by millions of years of natural selection, but by a single genetic mistake that disrupts the entire developmental pathway before it ever starts. And what that window shows is not, as the fantasy version of the scenario imagines, freedom. What it shows is the body losing its oldest instrument for reading itself, and everything downstream of that instrument quietly, incrementally degrading, without a single alarm ever sounding. Now return to something from the beginning. The framing of pain as the body's fastest internal communication system, a continuous broadcast of structural status, not a passive alarm, an active report. In a body that cannot produce that report, the silence is not peaceful. It is the silence of a plane whose instruments have stopped working. The plane is still flying, the pilot is still awake, the engines are still running, but the altimeter reads nothing. The airspeed indicator reads nothing. The fuel gauge reads nothing. The aircraft is moving through space with no data on what condition it is in or how much margin it has before something becomes irreversible. That is the closest analogy to this condition that the physics and biology actually support. Not invincibility, not freedom from suffering, an organism navigating continuous physical reality without the instrument panel that evolution spent hundreds of millions of years building. The bone fractures keep accumulating, the joints keep degrading, the infections keep progressing, not because the body is fragile, but because the reporting system is silent, and without reports, nothing is ever corrected. Everything drifts. And the person living inside that body is fully conscious of the world around them, fully capable of thought, feeling, relationship, experience, but separated from their own body's internal state in a way that has no parallel in typical human experience. These patients live full lives, they form families, they have careers, they navigate the world with awareness and adaptation, and the help of careful medical monitoring. Their lives are not defined entirely by the condition, but the condition is always there, in the background, in the silence. And some of them do something remarkable. Over years, they build deliberate systems to compensate for what biology never gave them. Visual inspection of the skin each morning, thermal monitoring, structured daily examination of joints and pressure points for swelling or discoloration that pain would have flagged automatically in anyone else. They are, in effect, attempting to run the instrument panel manually. It sounds, for a moment, like a solution, like the gap can be closed through discipline and awareness. That is the false resolution. Because what the long-term data from the 63-patient study makes clear is that the gap cannot be closed. It can be narrowed, partially, incompletely. The accumulated joint damage, the infections caught late, the fractures that healed wrong, these are not the outcomes of people who stopped trying. They are the outcomes of people who tried as hard as biology allows and still could not replicate what an intact pain system does automatically, below the level of thought, every second of every day. Conscious compensation is not the same as a system that never sleeps, and the body does not wait for you to remember to check. There is a kind of dread that comes not from sudden catastrophe but from gradual, silent accumulation. Not the earthquake but the slow movement of tectonic plates. Not the crash but the steady, invisible fatigue of metal under repeated stress, with no warning signal, year after year, until the moment when something finally gives. That is the dread embedded in this condition. Not the drama of a single catastrophic injury, the silence, the complete, unbroken silence of a body that has been accumulating damage for years, never once sending the signal that was supposed to say, something is wrong. The human body is, among other things, a remarkably durable machine. It heals, it adapts, it compensates, but its durability has always been conditional on one thing, that when damage occurs, something inside it knows. Remove that knowledge, and the durability does not disappear instantly. It erodes, slowly, quietly. Over years and decades, the small structural failures add up. The joints that were never rested, the infections that were never caught early, the fractures that healed wrong because no signal ever demanded stillness. The condition that sounds like a gift is, at its core, the removal of the body's capacity to know itself. And that is not a gift. That is a very specific, very quiet kind of loss. Think about all the signals that arrive today. The ache in a shoulder after sleeping in a bad position, the tightening in the chest that comes with stress, the low throb behind the eyes that says drink more water, rest more, stop pushing, the slight resistance in a knee that has been walked too many miles. All of it, constant, persistent, easy to ignore, easy to resent. All of it was a report. The body's continuous transmission of its own structural state, real-time, high-resolution, running without pause since before birth. Every signal that has ever been called annoying, inconvenient, distracting, was the nervous system doing the thing it was built across hundreds of millions of years to do, keeping track, filing updates, flagging problems early before they become irreversible. The signals dismissed as noise were never noise. They were the only thing keeping track. If this video changed the way you think about pain, the like button is there. It makes a larger difference than most people realize for a channel like this one. If you want to see what happens when another fundamental biological assumption gets tested against reality, 2 videos are on screen right now. Pick whichever one pulls you in. Subscribe if you want to be here when the next one comes out.